Welcome back after an outstanding time to chat about this morning's sessions over lunch and then hear a very stimulating keynote address at lunchtime. My name's Kevin Gallagher. I'm a professor in the Department of International Relations and a fellow at the Pardee Center, and on behalf of BU, I welcome all of you back. Today's session, this afternoon's session, is on economics and economic decision-making in China. How has this 30-year growth miracle come about, and perhaps more interestingly, how did certain actors make decisions to make such things come about? And the big question for this panel and for this whole conference is, to what extent can we expect some of this in the future? How might things change in the future? I'm really pleased to introduce to you three very distinguished China scholars who will be speaking today. The first is Barry Naughton, who's the Sakwanalok Chair of Chinese International Affairs and professor at the Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies at the University of California. Then we have Sebastian Heilmann, is a professor for comparative government and political economy of China and director of the Center for East Asian and Pacific Studies at Trier University, and also vice chairman of the German Association of Asian Studies. We also have Carl Riskin, distinguished professor of economics at the Queen's College since 1974. In your packets, we have extensive bios on all these three very impressive folks. I'd rather have you hear what they have to say rather than have to go through all of their bios. Take my word for it. Read it here. These folks are incredible people, and we're really honored to have them here with us at Boston University today. I believe, if it's okay with you, I'll go in the order of what we have here. Okay. It sort of makes sense from the papers that I read. Each of these folks will talk for about 15 minutes, and then I'll give some very brief commentary, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. And we'll start with Professor Barry Naughton.
And we've got some figures up there.
We go.
I'll let you look at the chart. I only have charts, so, but I'll let you look at some of the charts while I get started. So let me start with an apology. My paper was incredibly late, and for Kevin in particular, I appreciate the fact he received it late Saturday night and has had a chance to look at it. But there is a paper, and so one of the things about the paper is that there's a question mark on the end of the title. So it's not growth from quantity to quality, certainly, but rather the possibility that growth might go from quantity to quality. It's a huge privilege for me to be here. It's also a huge privilege to follow Ambassador Roy, who laid out some of the really critical issues and also touched on a lot of the critical economic issues. So let me start out by just mentioning part of my sort of framework for looking at these issues that is that can complement some of the things that Ambassador Roy said. I'd look at the issue of China's economic growth, assuming that there's an element of a pattern of East Asian growth, where before China, several East Asian countries, of course Japan first, went through periods of extremely rapid growth, during which very high investment coincided with the period when people were leaving the countryside on a massive scale, moving out of the farms and into the factories and other kinds of urban jobs. What we see in these past experiences is that countries sustain a very, very rapid economic growth for about, somewhere between 20 and 25 years. And then economic growth drops off quite dramatically. Now, when economic growth drops off quite dramatically, part of that is due to the relative exhaustion of this process of structural change, of people leaving the countryside and moving into the cities. But part of it, of course, is that at exactly that time, there happens to be a change in the way that societies function. There's increase in participation. Sometimes there's democratization, but in any case, there's a dramatic change in the sort of social agenda and the way that political forces affect demands for economic growth and different types of economic policy making. And of course, there are also unanticipated exogenous events, right, that shake people out of their traditional way of doing things. So my basic starting point is that China's situation is analogous, but not exactly the same. It's analogous in the sense that this basic period of high-speed growth has, of course, been going on in China for 30 years. And while the basic framework is similar to previous East Asian countries, the difference is this. China has grown even faster and even longer than any of the precursor economies. Now, I want to say something that is blindingly obvious and that all of the Chinese scholars in this room already know. And that is that one of the reasons that China's economic growth has been so exceptionally rapid has been that the Chinese leaders for the last 30 years have given overwhelming priority to the objective of high-speed economic growth. Now, that's so obvious. Why would I even bother to say something like that? I think it's worth saying now for two reasons. One is it doesn't have to be so, and therefore every now and then it's worth reminding ourselves. And two, because conditions are changing very, very rapidly right now. And therefore we're probably entering a phase where the way that Chinese policymakers mix rapid economic growth with other types of social objectives is probably going to undergo some very dramatic changes. And we don't, to be honest, we don't know what the outcome is going to be because we don't know how intense the economic shocks and disruptions flowing outward from the United States are going to be over the next couple of years. But I predict that the implications for China will be profound. It's in part because China is already entering into an economic recession that is going to be sharp and difficult to manage. But more importantly, I'm going to argue that this crisis is occurring at a time when China would anyway be making the beginning steps of a transition from growth at all costs to a more mixed package of policy objectives that would include almost certainly somewhat slower growth, but growth that intends to produce a more balanced set of social objectives, including higher social equality and better environmental quality. So let me talk about what I mean. First of all, when I talk about the emphasis on growth, the key point, I think, is to stress that it's not just that policymakers want growth. Of course they want growth. No developing country can conceive of reaching its objectives without having a healthy process of economic growth. But China has really gone beyond that in a couple of ways. First of all, its transition strategy has from the beginning been growth-oriented. Think of the contrast, say, with Poland that was willing to envision a sort of a year or two of pure transformation in order to make a dramatic shift to a new economic model with sort of marking time while the transition took place. That was never conceivable in China. If you look at industrial policy, although we can talk about the elements of balance and coherence and conflict in China's industrial policy, the fact of the matter is there are tens, 20s, perhaps hundreds of different industrial policies, all of which have the objective of increasing investment and accelerating the growth process. Sometimes they cancel each other out, but still when you put them all together, they tend to make an economy that is very, very much stresses and rewards a very high level of investment and a very high level of growth. And finally, the Chinese Communist Party, when we talk about the Chinese Communist Party remaking itself, one of the most fundamental ways in which the Communist Party has remade itself has been to create a set of high-powered incentives that reward specifically those local officials and those government bureaucrats as well as state enterprise managers who deliver a specified set of economic outcomes. Recall that Chinese local government leaders get graded every year. They get a scorecard, 100-point scorecard, and about 60 to 70 points on that scorecard, which determines their annual bonus, is related to growth, revenue growth, and industrial output growth. So this is a system that has a very, very strongly built-in, integrally woven in set of incentives that very strongly reward a very high rate of investment and a very high rate of growth. Now, when we take a look at the economic outcomes, we see precisely evidence of this particular set of policy orientations. Take a look at this graph, which just shows investment as a share of GDP, as a share of expenditure side GDP. What you see is investment here for a long time has been above 30%, which is high. But then for the last 4 years, investment as a share of GDP has been above 40% of GDP. In other words, China makes a greater investment effort as a share of total output than any other economy that we have ever seen in the world, period. Okay? Part of the reason China grows so fast is just that it devotes so much to the investment process, which of course is related to all these systemic factors. That means, in turn, that household consumption is an unusually small proportion of Chinese output. In fact, when you look at the second, this is sort of 3 mountain ranges, right? If you look at the first and second together, that's total household consumption, as less than 40% of GDP. In fact, last year it was only 35% of GDP. Now in the US, household consumption is 70% of GDP. So this is just a completely different economic structure. And while we'd probably say in the light of the financial crisis that US household consumption is too high and the US needs to save more, we also look at China and we say, hey, China's household consumption is probably too low. And China needs to move towards a more balanced growth path that would involve more household consumption as a total share and a program for moving more rapidly towards higher household consumption levels. Now, this system has, I mean, we can characterize this the way that the GDP is distributed in China as imbalanced, but on the other hand, let's face it, it's worked, right? This is a powerful growth machine, and one of the ways we can see it is the way that the recent very high-speed growth has powered this process of structural transformation. So just take a look at the blue line, which is the proportion of the total labor force that's in agriculture. And for now, just focus on the last 5 years, where the proportion of the total labor force in agriculture has dropped in only 5 years from 50% to 40%. That corresponds to 75 million people leaving agriculture and moving into non-agricultural occupations. So in other words, what we're seeing is China going through this period of structural change with maximum speed, because investment is at basically a maximum of what's possible, and therefore the process of structural change that lies behind that growth is also at a maximum. So a very, very impressive performance, and something that you can hardly really question. Let's leave this up for a little bit. I'll come back to it in a second. Now, at the same time, it's reasonable to connect this pell-mell pursuit of economic growth with lots of the social problems that have emerged in China over the past decade. Just to take two, well, no, let's take three that are particularly important. Number one, in this pursuit of growth, China's pursued a whole range of policies, we can't discuss them in detail here, that serve to concentrate economic power in corporations, in government, and to a certain extent in state corporations. So when we look at the distribution of economic power in China, it's not just that households consume a relatively small share of GDP. It's also that organizations, typically with a link to the state, command a large share of income in the first place. So power and resources are concentrated in government and large corporations. And this tendency has dramatically increased in recent years. Look at these numbers for industrial profits as a share of GDP. In the early part of the century, industrial enterprises didn't make that much money in terms of profit, but they've undergone this huge boom so that now 10% of GDP as revenue is reaped as profits by industrial enterprises. Some of them state-owned enterprises have also dramatically increased their profit, but even larger sort of non-state. So there's this imbalance of power where we're not even at the level of politics yet. Just at the level of economics, there's an imbalance of power in Chinese society. Second, related to that, disparities in income, deteriorating income distribution. Carl Ruskin is going to talk about that, so I won't say another word. And third, obviously, a deteriorating environment, which is also largely the result of consistently making decisions that privilege growth as opposed to other social objectives. Now, if we ask, which of these problems has the Chinese government started to address, then the answer is clear. Almost all of them, right? If we look at the content of the policies followed by the Hu Jintao-Wen Jiabao administration since 2003, what we see is a dramatic and impressive list of social policies designed to attack almost every one of the negative impacts of very high-speed growth, right? If we look at and again, the content is so rich that we really can't discuss it in detail, but just think of rural policy, where we see dramatic new resources going into education and health, and also reducing taxes in rural areas. We see a shift in policy toward migrants to support migration to cities, shift in policy toward labor that culminates in the new labor law in January 1st, 2008, and we see a dramatic change in sort of overall attitude towards environmental policy that perhaps hasn't been as effective yet, but certainly in terms of a principled reorientation is very, very significant. So when I thought of the title of this paper, I expected to talk about how the Chinese government was already beginning a shift of policy away from pure high-speed growth, from quantity, toward a less high-speed growth that perhaps delivered a better quality of life to the Chinese population. But instead, we've sort of been overtaken by events in the last year or two. And here in a nutshell is what has happened. If we look at the overall, I'm going to skip back here just to this consumption level. If we look back at the overall patterns of economic growth in the last 3 or 4 years, what we find is this shift towards a more socially friendly growth path has in fact been overwhelmed by this large-scale economic boom that China has been going through over the last 4 or 5 years. So in other words, look at the point where the household consumption starts to decline significantly as a share of GDP the last 4 years. This is exactly the point where the rhetoric of the Chinese government shifted away from growth and towards social protection, towards harmonious society, all those things. The initial shift of the Chinese government towards a quality growth as opposed to quantity growth has in fact been overwhelmed by a short-run economic boom driven by investment and, to a certain extent, also this dramatic increase in net exports, right? So that more and more of Chinese output has gone to feed this export surplus. In turn, because the Chinese currency has been kept too low for too long, when it would have been in China's interest, and especially the interest of Chinese consumers, to let the currency appreciate sooner. What's happened in the last 4 months, as Ambassador Roy pointed out so appropriately at lunch, is that all of a sudden this economic model has run into its own set of problems. It's important to realize that although the international financial crisis has triggered this set of problems in the in China, it would be wrong to think of China's economy right now as primarily taking a hit from a decline in export demand. Instead, what's happened is this huge domestic investment boom was tipped over. We already knew that there was this immense creation of industrial capacity, and we worried for years that it would be too much and that it would lead to some kind of short-term sharp recession or shock. What we didn't anticipate was that the external shock that triggered the Chinese recession would be not just a minor trigger, but rather a massive economic crisis in the United States. But when we take a look at these figures, because they're really pretty shocking, just look at electricity for a second. Last month, or rather in October, Chinese electricity production declined 4% compared to a year ago. Heavy industrial growth rates are already below light industrial growth rates. This is not an economic crisis that's driven by a turndown in exports. It's driven by a domestic economic cycle that's hitting a very sharp, steep reduction. How is the Chinese government responding? Well, of course, they're doing the one thing that their system really knows how to do better than anything else. They're doing the one thing that is integrally built into their system, and that is going back to the old model, fostering investment, fostering growth, rolling out a new stimulus plan. So we'll just have to wait and see how it all turns out.
Thank you very much.
Dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a challenge to be part of this enterprise here. The Pardee Center and Joe want us to gaze simultaneously into the rearview mirror and into the crystal ball. This is a multitasking challenge that is not easy to manage for a simply built male who is used to focus on doing one thing only at a time. Being distracted by what I believe to see in the crystal ball, there naturally will happen some cognitive lapses and intellectual accidents along the way. You will see that. What do I mean by authoritarian upgrading? The term authoritarian upgrading was coined by Stephen Heidemann in a paper for the Brookings Institution dealing with political and economic modernization in the Arab world. In his paper, Heidemann describes several features of authoritarian upgrading that I'm adapting to China selectively in this first table here, while adding several features that appear specific to the Chinese context. Since I'm dealing with economic governance, the points printed in bold type are most relevant to my presentation here. Engaging in consultative policy making, we had that point already over the day, maintaining direct state control over core parts of the economy and fostering a dynamic national innovation system. Though political competition and opposition still have no legitimate role in this variant of authoritarian governance, striking unconventional elements can be seen in the much more consultative, pluralistic, and globally integrated policy process that makes upgraded authoritarianism much smarter than its precursors in the 20th century and much more challenging to established democracies and market economies. The term innovative potential in the title of this paper points to the purposeful combination of market and non-market mechanisms to optimize the production, deployment, and use of new knowledge for sustainable growth. It is the combination, and that's important, of market and non-market, public and private forces that produces the strongest capacity for innovation in modern political economies. China is dealing with this mixed governance challenge in a very ambitious way. The Chinese leadership defined crafting an innovation-driven nation as one top priority in 2006, when a long-term plan for the development of science and technology was issued. According to the strategic plan's prescriptions, China is supposed to become a leading global science and technology power by the middle of the 21st century. Let me now present some findings on the intriguing interplay between processes of economic planning and economic experimentation in China's governance. These two core mechanisms in China's overall policy process are much too often ignored, since they don't fit well into standard models of modern market economies. Let's see. Oh, this is not working here. Which is the one here? I think you use this one here. Let me see. Right. So these are the core processual features. In this table, I summarize key components of China's policymaking approach to economic growth and restructuring. It's an unorthodox combination of processual features that we find here. We have an open-ended reform design. They never said what kind of system should be at the end, should be the end of the reform period. We have planning, setting policy priorities through planning. We have experimentation, searching for policy instruments through this process. Then we have extensive learning from abroad, as was mentioned by Menier in the morning. And we have this strange type of institutional layering, this conscious working with transitional and hybrid institutions over time. And sure, we have the authoritarian safeguards in addition. I'll concentrate on the second and third point today in my talk here. In characterizations of China's reform period, there's much talk about the demise of the plan and the transition from plan to market. Economists wrote scores of articles and books in which they told readers why China's government would have to retreat so as to make, and that's an important point I want to make, so as to make China's success story fit into Western marketization narratives and into Western-inspired economic models, coordination through plans is not allowed to play a role in standard explanations. Instead, to make China's achievements intelligible to Western preconceptions, it is widely assumed that markets must have taken over and must have pushed back state bureaucrats. Contrary to the sweeping mainstream logic that takes the demise of the plan for granted, institutionalized planning can be found in almost every policy domain in China to the present day. More importantly, there is evidence that development planning, after having undergone substantial reorganization in terms of content and process since the mid-1990s, is being practiced in a more consistent way today than in the earlier socialistic decades of PRC economic history. A careful inventory of the wide range of recent and current government plans and programs makes it clear that the very essence of state planning, that's anticipatory coordination and proactive prioritization of a government's economic activity instead of ad hoc or reactive intervention through individual policies, laws, and rescue schemes, is still being preserved in China's polity, with particularly profound ambitions in the realm of the national innovation system. In China, we find multi-year as well as annual plans, national as well as subnational plans in domains ranging from human resources, lawmaking, and social security to red tourism, and even national morality. All these examples, and there are more interesting ones even, make it clear that China still is a planning polity that is heavily engaged in managing economic, social, and technological development through state coordination and from a longer-term perspective. That's the point that Ambassador Roy mentioned, and I will return to that. Though the Chinese planning system moved further and further away from the Soviet-style planning system, it did not just undergo convergence with the modes of indicative planning that have been pursued, for example, in Japan. The pattern of plan making almost resembles, that we find here, almost resembles some models of transaction cost economics. The crucial question is what kind of coordination mechanism is most conducive to solving specific problems. So it's not plan versus market, not public versus private. It's a mixture of things. It's really a very differentiated way of dealing with policy issues here that we find in the plan making of the 2006 and 2010 period. Among China's policymakers, we rarely find an inclination to move to an ad hoc mode or bystander and fireguard mode of economic policy making that has become so prevalent and costly in the governance of Western political economies, as we are presently witnessing in the most risky arena of economic regulation, the financial markets. Whereas planning is about setting policy goals and clarifying national policy priorities for the longer term, experimentation is about finding the policy instruments to meet the goals and priorities. Policy experimentation in China consists of a process in which central policymakers encourage local officials to try out new ways of problem solving and then feed the local experiences back into national policy formulation. So this is the typical experimentation-based policy cycle that we find in China. I don't want to go into the details here. I just leave it up to you to have a look at that. This experimental cycle has decisively shaped the making of policies in areas ranging from rural decollectivization, foreign economic opening and promotion of private business to state sector restructuring and stock market regulation. In China, experimentation implies a policy process in which experimenting units try out a variety of methods and processes to find imaginative solutions to predefined tasks and to new problems that emerge during the experimental process. Policy experimentation is therefore not just equivalent to freewheeling trial and error or spontaneous policy diffusion. It is a purposeful activity geared to producing novel policy options through maximum tinkering. And this is an important point. Experimentation allows maximum tinkering, and this is maybe one really important recipe to the successes of policy adaptation and institutional innovation in China. It is this particular experimentalist approach to policy making that has helped to create an adaptive, even learning authoritarian state in China's economic governance. Thus, a type of governance that I call planning and experimentation in the shadow of hierarchy has served China very well during the past 3 decades. More specifically, in generating capacities for indigenous innovation as demanded by the current administration, a plethora of mutually complementary plans containing industrial, technology, and science policies, as well as educational and infrastructural components, have come to be one major focus of state activity in recent years. Yet, and that's the combination of things now, China's national innovation system does not rest exclusively on plans and industrial policy. It is combined with myriads of local-level implementation experiments that are concentrated in special development zones and industrial parks. Top-down systemic reforms are thus combined with bottom-up initiatives sponsored by local authorities that oftentimes go beyond or run ahead of national plans in constructing an innovation-driven economy. Though capacities for technological innovation are still confined to a limited number of special zones, China has, according to a recent OECD report, excelled in mobilizing resources for science and technology on an unprecedented scale and with exceptional speed, thanks to a combination of planning with experimentation in this crucial arena of state-promoted modernization. Let us turn to the crystal ball gazing now. I will be consciously one-sided. Please read this as one scenario that is extrapolated from major recent trends that are being discussed widely in Europe under headings such as neo-etatism, neo-statism, and soft socialism. Most studies of present-day China focus on traditional forces of discontinuity that may bring change or collapse to the present political system, social, economic, and political contradictions and upheaval. I want to focus on a new class of non-traditional factors that may work for authoritarian upgrading, not for systemic collapse or democratization in China and elsewhere. There's a number of novel macro trends underway that may compel us to redefine some basic assumptions about successful modes of governance for the future. And please note, the following passages do not reflect my own normative preferences. They are an extrapolation exclusively for analytical purposes. One of the most important points, and we are living in the middle of this, is the new cycle of economic ideology that we are witnessing from, to put it in simple terms, neoliberalism to neo-etatism. That's how some people call it now. And that's really a huge groundswell that's building up there presently against the market fundamentalism that has been discredited in recent times. We have expanding and interventionist governments. We have an output-based legitimation for governments. We have, I want to shorten that a little bit, demographic pressures that are building up, especially in Europe and in East Asia. And we have an obsession with technological innovation to counter resource, energy, and ecological risks. That's what I would see as the most important new forces that we are facing in the 21st century. So we are witnessing profound and cross-cutting changes here that provide a political, economic, and social playing field which will be rather different from what we have seen in the 19th and 20th century. What kind of comparative advantages may China's economic governance possess to outperform other political systems under these shifting conditions? State coordination for the longer term will be essential in dealing with the gigantic challenges of environmental degradation and the massive increase in the proportion of elderly people in China's demography. Markets won't help at all to contain the impact and prevent the worst in dealing with these mega challenges. Long-term policy prioritization will be in very strong demand, and it will be one core challenge for future policy making to overcome the short-termism that we have become used to over the 20th century. China, with its refocused planning capacity and its government-initiated rush for environmental technology, appears to be quite well equipped to make the transition from red authoritarianism to green authoritarianism over the next 2 decades. This is part of the scenario. Beyond the capacity for long-term policy prioritization, another crucial challenge for the 21st century is that we do not yet know the policy instruments and policy combinations that may help to master the many new challenges that we are facing. Here, the entrenched Chinese technique of policy experimentation comes into play. This may serve as a powerful mechanism of innovation in such a context. So overall, the combination of setting long-term policy priorities through planning and finding transitional policy fixes through experimentation may become a huge processual advantage for China in the years to come. If this governance mode, and this is a big if this governance mode is being maintained and adapted in creative ways. I suggest that China's mode of governance may become instrumental in dealing with the novel environment of the 21st century. China is in a position to be at the forefront of neo-etatist trends that are already underway. And the scenario that I depict here is one of a highly diversified techno-authoritarianism that is partly welfarist and partly green, out of necessity. And it will be a variant of authoritarian governance that is obsessed with technological innovation, yet must balance the traditional growth imperative with powerful social, political, and ecological concerns and constraints. As John Maynard Keynes said, and Ambassador Roy quoted this in his talk, the inevitable never happens. It's always the unexpected that happens. So let's take that seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Carl Riskin.
My brief is to talk about inequality in China, a subject which has been mentioned by several people already today, timidly by Barry, who backed away from it to let me have a go at it. And the reason, of course, that it is so much of interest is that, in fact, inequality has grown very rapidly in China in many dimensions. What was once one of the more egalitarian countries in the world in terms of measured income very rapidly became one of the more unequal ones. The 2006 Human Development Report of UNDP listed Gini coefficients for 177 countries, only 30 of which had higher inequality, income inequality, than China did. And if you look at this table of China's neighbors, 7 countries in Asia, with Ginis given for each of them. Sorry about that. Korea got out of place there. You see again that China's at the upper end of the scale and has quite high income inequality for its region of the world. Why are we concerned with income inequality? One reason, of course, is a normative reason on equity grounds. Excessive economic inequality is really contradictory to equality of opportunity, which is a goal that I think most people think is a good principle to govern economic policy and a good objective to achieve. Indeed, the 2006 National China Human Development Report, produced by Chinese scholars, explicitly states that equality of opportunity is the objective toward which China should strive. There are other reasons as well. Political and social stability are clearly affected by extreme inequality. Inequality makes poverty reduction harder to achieve. I won't go into these elasticities on the screen here, except to say that what they mean is that when inequality goes up while economic growth is occurring, poverty comes down much less quickly. Indeed, the responsiveness of poverty to inequality is of the same order of magnitude as its opposite responsiveness to income growth, so that if income is growing by a given percentage and inequality is rising by the same percentage, basically nothing will happen to poverty. It will stay where it is. There's a long history of debate about the relationship between inequality and growth. And I think it has varied historically, and it also varies by country, by part of the world. One recent study of that relationship in China has concluded, quote, inequality is harmful to growth, no matter what time horizon is considered. And this is not a normative conclusion saying we don't like inequality. It's a positive, objective conclusion. The data seem to indicate that inequality is harmful to economic growth under Chinese circumstances. There are different views, of course, and one of them is the normative view that comes out of a recent article arguing that, in fact, increasing inequality in China has been a race to the top, in which some people have run faster than others, but in general, most everyone has improved, and that this is a normal occurrence at a given stage in economic development, and that we shouldn't worry too much about it. This is a view that I don't share, but it is not an uncommon view. Another issue is what kind of inequality is important. I don't think I have actually time to talk about that, so I'll just skip over it. The two prominent dimensions of inequality that are most often discussed, of course, are urban-rural gap and regional inequality, usually looked at either as inequality among China's provinces or among groups of provinces, regional groupings of provinces. The two types of inequality are linked. That is, overall urban-rural inequality are shaped by changes in urban-rural inequality within three large macro regions, the eastern provinces, the central provinces, and the west. And also in the fact that massive rural-urban migration that has occurred for some 30 years should, in principle, act as an equalizing force. As migrants move eastward and into the cities from the countryside, they should bring down average rural incomes, at least relatively speaking, and raise rural incomes and reduce the urban-rural gap. So there's a little bit of a paradox here, because despite 2 decades of massive rural-urban migration, the urban-rural gap still is very, very high as conventionally measured, greater than 3 to 1 in the early 2000s, very high by international comparative standards. And of course, the income gap manifests itself in many other ways as well, a gap in life expectancy, in educational levels, in literacy, in morbidity, and so on and so forth. So a question arises, why didn't it shrink in response to this unprecedented factor mobility? Well, one of the reasons has to do with the way it's measured. And one set of scholars, led by Terry Sicular, has addressed that question recently, adjusting for regional price differences, which hadn't been done before. And this group found that, in fact, if you take into account differences in price levels between the regions of China, you eliminate a significant part of the urban-rural gap. 28% of it in 1995, 29% in 2002, and also essentially eliminate the increase in the urban-rural gap between those 2 years. It's worth pointing out, though, that because the gap was so large, even though the relative gap isn't increasing, the absolute gap is increasing, in fact, by 64% between 1995 and 2002. Another problem is that, as usually measured, urban-rural inequality leaves the migrants out of the picture because they're not officially part of the urban population, so their incomes are not counted by the surveyors, nor are they included in the rural population from which they came, and leaving them out also has an impact on the way the urban-rural gap is measured. If you adjust for both of these problems, the price differences among the regions and also the migrants, by putting the migrants in the urban population and then recalculating urban average income, you get quite a change in the measured urban-rural gap. Just look at it for 2002, because that's the year for which it's possible to include the migrants. Was not possible in 1995. And you see that the unadjusted urban-rural gap comes down from about 3.2 to 1 down to a little over 2.1 to 1, which is a very significant drop. And let me go back to there. It's significant because while China is still on the high side internationally, it's no longer quite the outlier it was. And it also leaves less of a question behind as to why the enormous changes of decades has not had more of an impact on the urban-rural gap. Here's a picture of the link between regional and urban-rural inequality, showing you that urban-rural inequality is quite different in the 3 macro regions. It's lowest in the east, less than 2 to 1, and highest in the west, 3.5 to 1. And you also see that the direction of change is quite different. The gap has been falling in the East. In the center and the West, it's been rising. So there is some sort of centrifugal process going on here, the reversal of which would finally bring down the gap. In 2002, urban-rural inequality was responsible for over half of total income inequality in the West, but only a quarter of it in the East. So a key to reducing the gap for China as a whole is to reverse this centrifugal tendency among the regions. As for regional inequality, there are some disagreements over trends. Has it actually been widening or has it been narrowing? And which units is it best to measure the gap for? And so I won't go into those kinds of issues. There are also some disagreements about causes. Is widening regional inequality a natural response to unequal geographic characteristics, and market forces will, just in the course of normal events, bring about a widening of these kinds of gaps early in the development experience? Or is it, as Justin Lin has argued, been endogenously determined by a wrong development strategy? I think others would associate themselves with that second view, perhaps not identifying the wrong development strategy exactly the way Justin Lin does, but arguing that it's a response to policy rather than being some sort of natural market response. However, I think if one looks at the literature on regional inequality, whatever side one comes out on these issues, virtually everybody who's written about it agrees that its behavior is not inevitable, but is in fact influenced by policy and in fact can be ameliorated by policy. Barry Naughton, for example, writing in 2002, was rather skeptical of the likelihood that regional polarization could be contained quickly, but expressed support for appropriate public investment to support those market forces that favored development of the interior. Aziz Khan and I, looking at what happened to inequality between 95 and 2002 and finding areas where we thought there was a decrease in inequality, pointed to various kinds of policies that were responsible for that, decreasing regressiveness of net taxes and much reduced inequality in housing income. Justin Lin, who I quoted a moment ago, favored moving to what he calls a comparative advantage favoring strategy of development in the interior provinces. The China Human Development Report of 2005, which was specifically on a more equitable development model, argued for relaxing the population registration system, the hukou system, unifying the labor market, and investing more in public education, public health, and so on, with the expectation that that would lead to reduced inequality. So everybody thinks that policy is relevant to the question of inequality. Here are some figures that the latest National Human Development Report of this year for China, which is on making public programs, public services available to everyone more equitably in the country, came up with on the cost of basic welfare programs. And the point of this graph, which includes the most important ones, the free compulsory 9-year education program, basic medical education, basic old age insurance, minimum living standard, the DBAO program for the entire population, would come to only about 7.5% of total budget revenue. So they're making the case that the kinds of policy changes that are needed are actually not overwhelmingly ambitious in terms of the revenues required to reach them. I think the future of inequality in China is really dependent on the outcome of the tension between fear of social and political instability on the one hand, and the kinds of structural impediments to changing the real distribution of income through effective public policy on the other. Barry spoke, I think, eloquently about some of those impediments. Pessimists, of whom Barry may be one, and Christine Wong certainly is, can point to a broken, quote, broken intergovernmental fiscal system that is unable to support national policy implementation. Optimists, on the other hand, can point to the considerable progress that has already been made in constructing a social safety net, committing to free universal primary education, launching an apparently serious reform of health care, which we'll hear more about from Professor Liu a little bit later today. The normative benefits of a more equitable development strategy I've already talked about, but in addition, I think some of China's most pressing economic problems would also be eased by moving toward a less inegalitarian system. Chinese growth would be tied less closely to foreign demand, as citizens would no longer have to save such a high proportion of their incomes. Even the trade imbalance of the U.S. would probably benefit from the emergence of a Chinese population that felt freer to consume and didn't have to save as much. The stakes are high. These various benefits of a more equitable development approach, plus the fear of instability, constitute the positive incentives for change. If they prevail, income inequality in China could decline to levels more normal in that region of the world. If not, forces widening inequality could continue to dominate at the cost of some jeopardy to equity, political legitimacy, and social stability. What I haven't said anything about and don't have time to, maybe we'll come back to this in the discussion, is the impact of the current crisis on the likelihood of the choice between these two possibilities. And I think we'll come back to that later. Thank you.
Thank you. I am not a China scholar, but I've been asked to comment on this on these presentations for 10 minutes before I open it up to question and answer with you folks. So I am not going to serve as a discussant in the traditional manner at an academic conference and say, well, I know the pile of literature that these folks are standing on and what the differences between their nuanced arguments are and so forth. I'm going to look at the broader implications and say, what do some of these three papers, what do they fit together to say to us on two levels? What does it tell us about the development process in general and the state of development thinking? And secondly, what is China's rise? What's the implications of it for other countries outside of China? And I'll venture that there's three big points to make from these papers. And one is that growth matters. If you look at the state of development thinking, excuse me, if you look and listen to the state of development thinking, development has become defined as poverty alleviation, bed nets to solve the malaria problem, conditional cash transfers to deal with poverty alleviation and inequality types of issues. That's become the field of development. And I think one thing that everyone here takes for granted is that growth fundamentally matters, and that policies for growth are a core part of economic development that the development profession, me included, I'm a recovering economist, don't pay enough attention to. And that core to the growth process, especially at early levels of development, government matters. And I think all Chinese scholars or scholars of the Chinese economy take this for granted. And to push the authors and the entire community a little bit, unfortunately, you need to prove the relationship between the government and the economic growth. And I know that is super difficult to do. We went through all this with the East Asian Miracle Report and so forth. But the alternative narrative to China outside of China is completely different from what you hear in these papers, which I believe you. I've read Barry Naughton's complete book. You folks are the experts on this stuff. But in Geneva and Washington, the narrative grows a little bit differently. It says that economic liberalization in China has been the core driver of economic growth, and therefore Mexico or Uruguay should privatize all of its state-owned enterprises, and it'll get the growth. However, state-owned enterprises are a key part of the Chinese growth story. On inequality in the environment, if you have liberalization, you'll get economic growth. If you get the economic growth, the environmental Kuznets curve, the original Kuznets curve, says you can grow now, worry about the inequality later. That'll eventually come, liberalize first. And the environmental Kuznets curve tells us, or it's used by folks in Geneva and Washington to say, if you liberalize and grow, not only will you eventually and automatically reduce inequality, but you will reduce environmental degradation as well. That is not what these papers are saying, but this is sort of a think tank government policy narrative that sloppy academics also get into as well, but they get more press, and they get that is the story to beat even after this crisis. The biggest thing about all three of these papers, though, in relation to the government policies, the political economy matters even more. It's not just policies that the Chinese government has enacted to stimulate economic growth. It's the political economy of those policies, and that the future matters in terms of inequality and the environment. I have to show this. This is from some work that I've been doing. It's pretty messy, but it shows the top 100 countries in terms of manufacturing competitiveness from 1980 to 2005. Okay, as their total manufacturing exports as a percent of manufacturing exports in the total in all of the world. In 1980, China was not on the map. They were not they were not in the top 100 exporters in the world. They became number 28 in 1985, number 8 in 1995, number 5 in 2000, and number 3 in 2005. And Hong Kong and Macau is in these numbers as well, is right up there. And after, starting here, China counts those two countries too. So by 2005, China has become the number one most competitive manufacturing exporter over time. And in terms of quality, the period from 2001 to 2008 has not only been low wage, as Heilman talked about, the technological sophistication of exports and manufacturing capacity in China is unrivaled. This isn't enough to convince Geneva and Washington that the government has played a role. Right? No other country has ever done this. Barry Naughton showed that in his book and in his comment. No other country has ever done this in the history of the world economy in such a short period of time. There is a narrative out there that this happened magically, and I challenge our speakers to show us how it happened. There's a massive controversy about the role of government and industrial policy in economies. And I take from the political science literature and a couple enlightened economists who say that if the government is going to get involved in industrial policy and government enhancing growth, there are 4 political economy things that need to be overcome. Danny Roderick talks about the real need for leadership and multilateral coordination. Peter Evans talks about embedded autonomy, that you need private-public partnerships where the government is working with the private sector so that the government doesn't pick crazy winners. One of the biggest critiques of industrial policies is that governments can't predict winners. And Alice Amsden talks about reciprocal control mechanisms, that you need mechanisms to control and discipline capital through the process, and that there needs to be a process of self-discovery, meaning the governments can't just say, I know exactly these 10 sectors are the ones that I want to be great at in 35 years, that you need an experimental process to get you there. What's interesting, if you take that literature from outside the sort of Chinese scholarship, although a lot of these folks reference a lot of these people, and I quote here a couple of the comments from the different papers here, and show that China meets a lot of these criteria. It obviously has the leadership. Barry talked about development is the only hard turn, right? that the goal of the government has been economic growth over this period. The consultative policymaking that you talk about in your paper is an example of embedded autonomy. In Barry Naughton's other work, he talks about not only how the government has done a better job of picking winners, but they've been very sharp in how they deal with the potential losers through a gradual approach and doing pilot-based market liberalization away from the losers so that they lose in a slower period of time. I don't know if I'm summarizing 200 pages that well. And that that two of the papers here talk about how capital gets disciplined, and that self-discovery, there's been a big premium on this whole process of experimentation. Well, the future matters as well as I've said. The narrative is, well, grow first, worry about inequality later. Carl Riskin shows us that might not necessarily be great for the economy just on economic terms. We know from the growth elasticity of poverty that the more inequality that you have, the less people you'll pull out of poverty. And the work that he's done in this paper and cites shows that on economic terms alone, inequality is not going to take care of itself without coordinated policy action. Professor Hyland says that the government will be able to take care of this. And in addition to the inequality issue Barry Naughton has talked about, and I'm sure it came up this morning, I had to teach, that the inequality problem could threaten the regime in and of itself and that cause political problems. Similar issues with the environment. Last slide is that, well, what about China and the future of everyone else? Is China's continued export boom, assuming that it continues, which it may not, does that mean cheap prices and higher welfare for everyone? Or if you go to seminars like this, which there's been scores of them in Africa and Latin America over the past 5 years on how does China affect us, they're concerned that China's appetite for natural resources has returned those regions, especially commodities exporters, towards resource curses. This has been accentuated by a whole debate about deindustrialization in Africa and Latin America, from import competition in their own economies from imports from China, and they're rapidly losing world markets outside of China and Latin America and Africa. That graph that I showed you, I didn't do for this conference. I usually do it with another set of colors that show Latin American countries' competitiveness diving down the graph over the same period of time. And another question is, what is the impact of increased China demand on environmental degradation? To put in a plug for Robert Kaufman, who's chairing the next session, he's done incredible work on the impacts of China demand on soy production in the Brazilian Amazon. This is a picture of soy production in 1990 in the Brazilian Amazon. 42.7% of it goes to China, and this is a picture of it in 2005. Thank you. If I may, I'm not sure if this is the way you did it before, so tell me if I'm wrong. I'll take a small cluster and ask these folks to do it. And am I asking people to speak into the microphone? Okay. Let's take a handful of questions for these incredible papers that we just heard from. Jennifer.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Badursky. I'm a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I was wondering, what do you believe, because the Asian financial crisis, China came out fairly unscathed, but its economy wasn't as liberalized as it is today. So the economy of today, it's much more impacted by the international financial crisis. What do you believe are the future implications of its economic policies or political policies due to the crisis?
Again, let's take a couple, if there are a couple, and then there's one over here.
I was curious, Professor Naughton, you talked about your final slide was the decrease in electricity production in China. And you sort of said this is evidence supporting the fact that it's not a diminution of exports that's really driving the current Chinese recession, but it's really the coming home to roost of the overinvestment period. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the logic underpinning that conclusion, because I'm not sure if you could read the evidence also supporting the idea that it's because of future expectations of diminished export growth that people are pulling back on the investment. So which comes first, sort of cause versus effect on that?
One more. Don't take a round. In the front.
Was taken by your last comment about China's expansion, economic expansion, implication on Latin America, Africa, and it really reminded me of the conventional zero-sum game model of the economics. So I wonder whether that's inevitable, or can the panel come up with some counterexamples of win-win new economics in the global market?
Should we respond in the order that you folks gave your papers, or go backward forward? It's up to you. Go ahead.
Okay. I guess first on the impact of the financial crisis. I mean, there's, again, as Ambassador Roy pointed out at lunchtime, I mean, there are a lot of reasons to believe that China can sidestep some of the direct financial impacts because of a certain amount of insulation of the capital account and this huge stockpile of foreign exchange reserves. So it's not that China has to be that vulnerable to the U.S. financial crisis per se, but rather that compared to 10 years ago, the imbalances and the domestic economic problems in China, I think are short-term much worse. I mean, of course, in '98 too, China was in a kind of a recession because they were at the last stages of kind of beating out inflation from the system, and they were shrinking the state sector. So there was a lot of painful restructuring going on. But they had, I think pretty much that was more gradual, and they had pretty much completed that process anyway, it was underway when the Asian financial crisis hit. Whereas now, this is all just happening very quickly. So everything, we're just revising our views so quickly as information comes in. And so my argument about electricity may not be 100% logical. It is certainly true that although exports, Chinese exports are still growing quite healthily, but you're absolutely right that expectations of the future are plummeting drastically. So there must be some effect of cutting back investment and running factories more slowly, thinking about orders for next year. But on the other hand, housing starts to decline earlier this year. Sales of heavy industrial goods have been dropping. So I'm assuming as a first approximation that the electricity downturn is a lot more closely explained by that. But I admit it's not 100% rigorous.
Responses to these questions here?
Just maybe this is a chance to get in the point about the impact of the crisis on the whole more equitable growth strategy question. I'm actually a bit pessimistic about it, I guess for a couple of reasons. Although the World Bank has been pushing China very hard to use this massive stimulus package as a way to rebalance the economy, and others as well, I'm not sure that they're going to be able to do it, partly because of what Barry said earlier in his talk about this sort of instinctive reaction in a crisis to go back to what is tried and true and has worked well for so long, which is to just go back to generating as high a growth rate as possible. And partly because I think it's inevitable that whatever the stimulus package accomplishes, there's going to be a deceleration in that growth rate for at least a while. And it's much easier to change structure when you're growing very rapidly, and you can use part of the premium of that growth each year to redirect investment than you can when growth itself is under pressure. And there are various interest groups who are suffering because of that, who are likely to resist a significant restructuring of investment. And so I think for both of those reasons, I hope I'm proven wrong, but I suspect that the move toward a more equitable, balanced, pro-consumption, pro-rural, pro-social services, pro-environment growth strategy may well have to be put off for a little while.
Do you mind if I jump in on that for a second?
Right.
And I want to say I very much agree with Carl's analysis there, except that you do wonder if after 6 months or a year we might start to see some other dramatic new initiatives. So they're pretty flexible.
Mm-hmm. One of the most dangerous forces in crisis management and in this kind of economic emergency governance that we are witnessing presently are expectations. And expectations have grown exponentially in China. So they really expect high growth and income growth And this is something that really may turn against the government. And that's, we have a government here, a high-capacity government, which can fiscally, in fiscal terms and in stimulating terms, it might be possible to counter this kind of crisis. But I have to say, I'm kind of skeptical. I'm not so sure in the face of those really huge expectations that have built up over now 1.5 or almost 2 decades in China. They are used to high growth. They are used to growing incomes, especially those that have benefited the most from the reforms, from reform and opening, and that are close to the party, that are maybe the most important clientele to the party, the most important constituency for the party. These expectations will be shattered, maybe. So let's see what's coming out of that. So this is a non-traditional factor again. We have something here, a force that we cannot, we shouldn't calculate on this force to be stable. I think this is really destabilizing. Let's see. The other thing, on the marketization narrative, I think this has come to an end already, even in international organizations. We have this fine report put together by the Commission on Growth that was headed by Mike Spence, one of the Nobel laureates of former years. This is an interesting report there, because this is meant to substitute for the Washington consensus to a certain degree. And there they are naturally, they are saying that the role of the government is crucial, especially in the initiating phases of development, economic modernization, and that experimentation is crucial. Things like that. There are some of those assumptions that have been there in the past. They are actually thrown overboard already. Yeah. So it's not markets that can solve all the problems altogether. So what I'm seeing here, and this is a very recent phenomenon. This report came out in September, but this is powerful and high level. And so I'm actually kind of expecting a reorientation in this. In the standard explanation of rapid economic growth that is being put forward by international organizations. This is an interesting report, by the way. The Growth Commission report by this commission was headed by Mike Spence. Really an interesting read also. So that the marketization narrative, and I was trying to criticize this heavily here, to a certain extent has really come to an end. I mean, there's just many of the parts and elements, this thing has really come apart, actually, over the recent months. So there's a lot of skepticism. Same thing about the role of government. Okay, that has to do with this. If all of the top performers pursued thick industrial policy, and we have this evidence from the 20th century, from the late 20th century, if the top performers all had industrial policies, and this is an argument I borrowed from Danny Roderick, it's very likely that industrial policy played a crucial role, even if we don't have quantitative models to corroborate the evidence. Even if this is the case. But it's very, I mean, it's impressive, you know, that the top performers all have that. And this is, I think, for us, reason enough to have a closer look at the processes there that made it possible. And we have planned big pushes. That's another thing that we can document. We have planned and very successful big pushes in the realm of manpower, infrastructure, technology. And in these realms, we have very active and heavily spending governments all over East Asia.
If I can respond to that, since that was directed to me, at 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday night, what's today? Sunday night, 2 o'clock in the morning last night, the developed countries saw to it that in the new text, and they're starting WTO negotiations again, probably at the end of this week. Or they at least came up with a draft text, and the draft text, the United States and Europe put in what's called an anti-concentration clause. You can't concentrate any of your tariff protections in any one sector, and so it certainly hasn't. This idea certainly hasn't died in the North. And related to the Spence Commission report, fascinating report. It's especially Barry Naughton talked about how Chinese gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP has been 40% a year. The Spence Commission report says you need 25% a year to grow. It's pretty fascinating. However, there was a major controversy in the crafters of the Spence Commission report, and on the very end, they did not. They said government matters, but they said industrial policy is give or take, and it takes something like these 5 things, which I think in your papers you're getting towards. There's a paper to be written to sort of confront that literature that says that China's getting the political economy right in addition to the policies right, and that'll have a contribution in the literature outside of China. Okay, let's take another round of comments. We've got one in the front, one in the back, and right here, although, I was going to say, since it's easy to hand it to her, but you're halfway there, it's up to you.
Right. I wonder whether the panel could comment on fixing the fiscal reform. As Carl Riskin pointed out, that Christine Wong is pretty pessimistic about the fiscal reform not being able to deliver public goods and services to those in the Western areas. Without fixing the fiscal reform, do you think the central government could really distribute some of the growth or potential of growth to those in the central and western areas?
Take the cluster again.
I was wondering if we could have the best judgment, I'm sorry, from all three of you about when China will change, if China will change from an export-led growth policy.
Speak louder, please.
Oh, good. Now you know what it feels like. I was wondering, he says the mic's only for the cameras. There's no miking in this room. When, from all three of you, will China, or if China will move from an export-led strategy to a domestic concentrated strategy that will tap into some of the savings? I'd really just like your best guesstimate if I can, or if you're telling me that it's silly, it never will in the next 20 or 30 years or something. I think that would be very helpful to hear. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Take another one up here in the front.
Hi. A lot of Professor Heilman's,
Take her
the beginning of
example and
Professor.
speak.
Oh, sure. I can speak very loudly.
Good.
Hold this farther. A lot of Professor Heilman's presentation in the beginning was devoted to talking about the plan and somewhat criticizing people who said that getting rid of the planned economy was actually the thing that made China grow very quickly. But I wasn't clear what your vision is of what the plan is. I mean, to say that China grew out of the plan, as Professor Naughton did, is very different from saying that China abandoned industrial policy and industrial planning. Professor Naughton was talking about the planned economy, which was the state-owned enterprises and the plan and the fixed prices and the whole bit. So clearly, everybody agrees that one's gone and that was not necessarily, and that getting past that was very important. You said that it's not going to look like indicative planning like Japan's, but some of this has to do with the timing, right? So Japan in 1960s was not engaged in indicative planning, at least not only indicative planning. It was engaged in a great deal of government-directed lending, a great deal of tariff protection, a lot of things that weren't just indicative planning. We can look around other places in East Asia, as you sort of suggested in your answer to the last question, and there's a huge range of stuff that we could be talking about, some of which looks very much like planning, and some of which looks very much like indicative planning. But I don't know exactly where it is you think that China is now, and whether you have a sense that that's going to change out to the future. Because particularly if we're going to accept Ambassador Roy's suggestion that Chinese-style market capitalism with socialist characteristics might become a model for other places, well, I would like to understand what the future of this model is, and also how you see the current status. Thank you.
Squeezing in a fourth because it's supposedly related.
I was impressed by the last slide you showed of the Amazonic forest being eaten up by soy exported to China. Does China care about these larger implications of its own economic policies? And if China does not, who should? The Brazilians or some other international organization?
I guess we have a traditional order now, so I'm supposed to go first. I'll just answer the one question that I think was directed at me. When we look far enough into the future, I think we see a China that certainly has a big enough domestic market that it can fully, does not need to be an export-oriented country in any sense of the word, and can have balanced external accounts. The paradox is, in the short run, we're not going to see that at all. And if you just think about China and the United States, these two mirror image twins, right, where our flaws are their merits and their merits are our merits are their flaws, right, where we don't save enough and they save too much. So we both need to change. But the economic crisis makes it more difficult for both of us to change. The United States is not going to borrow less in 2009. We're going to borrow way more. So the global system is going to be more unbalanced in 2009 than it has been. So a similar problem afflicts the Chinese economy because household income is taking a hit. So household consumption is going to go up? Maybe. You know, it depends how effective the stimulus package really is. But I think Carl has pointed out a lot of reasons why it won't be as effective in stimulating consumption as we would hope.
Mm-hmm. So on the planning process, that's an interesting thing because what I'm trying to do here, and maybe you felt that too, I'm trying to get away from institutions, from a static picture. For me, the picture is a fluid policy environment in China. This is actually the main feature of the reform process there. We cannot nail down institutions that have been there from 1978 to 2008 now. So the interesting here is one thing, the experimentation process or the planning process. And what I want to what I would like to argue here is that it's a very differentiated way of dealing with diverse policy arenas, policy challenges. So they are applying different planning methods, different planning processes actually to different policy areas. So we have indicative planning in some parts, we have the mandatory planning even in the infrastructural realm, and we have this new kind of cooperative, contractual government enterprise cooperation in some parts of the planning process. And this is new. This is something that Japan did, that's right, from the 1960s to the 1980s. And so they actually are learning a lot. There's a lot of exchanges going on between Japanese planners, retired Japanese planners, and the NDRC in China today, interestingly, in the last few years. It's because they are now shifting to spatial planning, more infrastructural and spatial planning, what the Japanese did in the 1980s, and were quite successful in some aspects there. So the interesting thing here is, again, it's a moving target, but still there's a pattern behind it, and it's shifting. So it's not the institutional static picture that I want to stress here. It's really this kind of fluid policy environment. That's why I'm really concentrated now on processes, not on institutions. Institutions are reconfigured all over the way, so we have an economic administration, economic institutions that are actually constantly changing over the last 30 years. So that's, I would put it in a radical way, that's my conclusion, just from my recent research, that the informational content of institutions in China's reform and opening up process is very low, actually. Processes are much more important, processual patterns are much more important than institutions for explaining, for understanding this reform process.
And also just a general point in this same area is that it's very easy to fall into the sort of stylized assumption that there's something called capitalism and something called central planning, and there's no variety within those groups. Well, there may not be too much variety within the central planning category, although I think there actually is. If you look at the way the Russians did it and then compare that with the way the Chinese did it, actually are enormous differences. But certainly within the capitalist category, there are also enormous differences. And I think we have to avoid the trap of thinking that there's one model that constitutes capitalism in which the role of the state and the role of the market are fixed and unchangeable. This is just historically false. It's false if you look around the world today. And China actually has many different models, including some of its own devising, to choose from in its own evolution. On the question of fiscal reform and rebalancing the economy and reaching the poor areas and so on, you know, I tend to be less pessimistic than my good friend Christine Wong, who's so deeply involved in the details of the way the public finance system works that she's, I think, perhaps very sensitive to the flaws, remaining flaws in it and so on. But it has changed, and it changes almost continuously. And the fact that resources have, in fact, been redirected to an unemployment insurance system, to a DBAO system that has millions of people benefiting from it, that there's a serious redirection of resources toward education and apparently on its way toward public health as well. I mean, all of this involves de facto changes in the fiscal system and public policy. And I think China's doing it the way they've done so much else. They're doing it by stepping out to cross the river and making adjustments as they go in order to achieve objectives which are very important to them. Perhaps one of the key themes of my paper are that if you had no strong incentives to change the system, then you could easily point to the barriers and say it'll never happen. But in fact, there are strong incentives to change it. And those incentives perhaps will prevail. So I'm not quite that pessimistic about it. There was a question about the Amazon. Do the Chinese care? I think probably they don't care about the impact on global warming of the disappearance of the rainforest because they're buying soy, but they are aware of the general issue of the impact on the global economy, global environment. And I think they're quite willing to enter into international arrangements when such are made available to them, which they have not been yet, that could help them to change their own policies. And I'm very much hoping that a new administration in this country will be motivated to look to those kinds of arrangements with China, because obviously the well-being of the Chinese population is very much at stake, as well as our own.
Sure, I don't blame the Chinese at all for the Brazilian Amazon. They just happen to be the folks at the global economic store during the boom. I think it has lessons for what Barry, all the folks here said. Maybe China will put environment and inequality on the back burner in the post-crisis period. That's exactly what Brazil did. Brazil had major currency crisis in the late 1990s, and then China enters the WTO and is a source of growth for its #1 comparative advantage commodity. And they had to sacrifice, or at least the decision makers in the Cardoso and Lula governments sacrificed. They're the most unequal place on the planet. Brazil, most unequal place in the planet, and the largest number of people living less than $1.25 a day in the Western Hemisphere. They made the decision that they had to put that aside to go for it, and a lot of it's a public goods problem that we're all paying for, and I would agree with Carl on China. Actually, China, relative to other, this is sort of runs counter to the environmental Kuznets curve, because counter to many of the perceptions in the literature about developing countries' willingness to engage in environmental issues, they've done an incredible job on a lot of issues. Not on coal, like Barry Naughton talks about in his paper, but didn't talk about so much in his presentation. But their fuel efficiency standards, hopefully this will change next year or the year after, are stronger than those in the United States. 3 weeks ago, right after the crisis, 3 weeks ago, China hosted a developing country climate change conference where they proposed a global technological transfer fund for clean technology, which the whole world is reacting against. And they're proactive environmental multilateralists. And hopefully they'll be met with a proactive environmental multilateralist in February. We're supposed to end at 3:15. Is there one or two pressing questions? Well, on behalf of the Pardee Center, I want to point out that we've given each of our presenters a black box, which contains a gift. And
Sort of thing you'd worry about at the airport.
No kidding. Well, I think you can get through customs on that. Really thank all of you for a very interesting discussion, and really thank all of our panelists. Thank them for coming to BU and presenting all this stuff with us. This has been really exciting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.